Hello, I'm the awesome tutor, and today we're going to be looking at causes of a current account deficit and causes of a current account surplus. Let's start with high levels of consumption. That's usually synonymous with a boom in aggregate demand or a slump in aggregate demand for low levels of consumption. Consumer societies, countries where the average citizen is over-obsessed about consumption. Spend here, spend there, get this loan, buy a new car, buy a new house, whatever. And prime examples of these are the UK and US. For the US, household consumption is about 68% of GDP. And for the UK, household consumption is about 60% of GDP. And because you have high levels of consumption, the marginal propensity to import is high. So you're more likely to buy imports from abroad, like luxury goods, and that means that the value of imports is higher than the value of exports usually. And what that does is it reduces net exports and results in a trade deficit, which will result in a current account deficit. The opposite can be said for a current account surplus. You have countries like Germany and the Netherlands, where their marginal propensity to consume is 0.22 and 0.11. And it's obviously the maximum is 1, so it's a decimal. So with those countries, they're more likely to save money rather than spend it. So that means that they're more likely to have a trade surplus, leading to a current account surplus. Strong exchange rate. If you have a strong exchange rate, then that means the price of your exports increases, usually leading to the value of exports decreasing. And synonymous with that is the price of imports decreasing and the value of imports increasing, meaning that net exports decreases, giving you a trade deficit, which gives you a current account deficit. Prime example of this is the US. In 1973, there was a deal with Saudi Arabia to sell oil in the dollar, and that is known today as the petrodollar. And what the petrodollar does is it generates artificial demand for the currency of the dollar. And because of that, it overvalues the exchange rate. And that's one of the reasons why the UK has such a large current account deficit, and it's been nearly consistent for current account surplus. A weak exchange rate. We can look at China. China has been accused of manipulating its exchange rate, keeping it artificially low so that their exports are more competitive. Because if you have a weak exchange rate, what happens is the price of exports decreases, making them more price competitive. So usually the value of exports increases. And with imports, it's the opposite. And that means that net exports increases, trade surplus leading to current account surplus. A slump in the global prices of exports and a rise in the global prices of exports. Prime example of this is the oil industry with oil shocks, demand side shocks, supply side shocks. In 1973, there was an oil shock where prices rose up significantly, meaning that any country whose exports specialize in oil meant that the value of their exports increases. For example, Saudi Arabia, oil is such a large part of their economy and their export economy, so that means that if the price of oil increases due to a supply-side shock, then that means the value of their exports will increase. Okay? Because oil is an inelastic commodity. The demand for oil is inelastic. So if price increases from P to P1, okay, the gain in revenue is larger than the loss in revenue, meaning that the value of exports increases. The same can be said with a negative supply-side shock in oil. In 2014, the price of oil decreased significantly. I think it went from something like $100 a barrel to $20 a barrel or less. You can check the statistics for that. But that meant the opposite effect of what happens here. Okay, the price of oil decreased significantly, meaning that the value of the exports of oil exporting countries decreased significantly, and obviously that led to a reduction in net exports, leading to a trade oh goodness me. This is supposed to go here, and that's supposed to go there. So with a rise in global oil prices, sorry about this mistake, for a rise in global oil prices, net exports increases, and that leads to a current account surplus. 2014, when the price of oil went down significantly, that meant the value of exports decreases, and that gives you a trade deficit, leading to a current account deficit. So these are flipped. Low R&D spending and high R&D spending. If you have high spending in research and development, you have something to sell to the world. Okay, it makes your exports more competitive. Germany, with their specialization in high value added manufacturing. Cars, their cars. Germany has good cars, Volkswagen, etc. So they have something to sell to the world. Their exports they have a comparative advantage in high value-added manufacturing because of their high research and development, meaning that the value of their exports is higher than the value of their imports, leading to a trade surplus and a current account surplus. Low R&D spending gives you the opposite. Your exports are less competitive. So value of exports decreases, and the net exports decreases, leading to a trade deficit and a current account deficit. Usually with these causes, they lead to a trade deficit or surplus, which consequently leads to a current account deficit or surplus because trade is such a large part of the current account. Productivity gap and strong productivity. If you have a productivity gap, the level of productivity in your country is lower relative to other countries. So for example, the US and the UK education system, I think it's fair to say, is appalling. Or most public school systems around the world are not that good. So what that leads to is low productivity of labor. If you want, you can draw a diagram of this with LRAS shifting to the left. And show the consequent effects of that. But what that means is, because you have a productivity gap, your average cost of production is higher than other countries, meaning that your exports are less competitive. And that leads to a current account deficit. Strong productivity, the exact opposite. Because you have high productivity, your exports are more price competitive. High relative inflation, low relative inflation. I need more space to explain this. Okay, so say your country A. The rate of inflation in your country is 10%. And you have country C. You export to that country. You have another country, country B, and the inflation rate in that country is 5%. That means usually that the prices of exports of B are relatively lower than the prices of your exports. So C is more likely to import from country B. So because you have higher relative inflation than other countries, your exports are less price competitive. And another effect of this is that domestic citizens, they'll find imports from places like country B to be cheaper than domestic products within the country itself. So the people are more likely to import than buy domestic goods as well. So that obviously leads to a trade deficit with lower net exports, leading to a current account deficit. If you're country B, however, the opposite occurs. Your exports are more price competitive if you have a lower relative rate of inflation. So country B is likely to have a current account surplus because its exports are more price competitive and people are more likely to buy domestic goods than import from abroad because the prices from abroad are relatively higher. So country B is going to have a trade surplus because net exports will be higher, leading to a current account surplus. This has been the Awesome Tutor. Bye.